Hello everyone, and welcome to or back to the channel. I'm Origin Gaming, and this is the beginning of a new series I'm calling My Good Christian Minecraft World. My goal with this series is going to be to cover the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, one book at a time. For each book, I'll be providing summaries, highlighting key themes, and giving my own commentary along the way. As for why I'm doing all of this, to the background of playing hardcore survival Minecraft, the answer is that while my work and education is in the fields of ministry and theology, I've always enjoyed playing video games and wanted a way to bring those two things together. Anyways, with that bit of introduction out of the way, let's get right into the creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2. Notice that I did say stories plural. The creation account that runs from Genesis 1:1 until chapter 2, verse 3, is more of a grand cosmological story about the whole of creation. From verses 4 and onward tells a different story that focuses specifically on humanity and humanity's fall later than in chapter 3. But let's first focus on chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The stage is set, and the process of creation has begun. The earth is initially formless, void, or chaotic. But on the face of this darkness and void is the Spirit, or breath of God. These first few verses tell us that we're already in the midst of the act of creation. Things are currently chaotic, but the rest of the chapter will narrate how God makes order out of that chaos. On day 1, God separates the light from the darkness, creating day and night. On day 2, God separates the sky, the heavens, from the earth. On day 3, God forms the land and the vegetation. On day 4, the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, the creatures of the sea, and on day 6, the creatures of the land, ultimately culminating in the creation of humanity. Many people spend a lot of time arguing about whether or not we're meant to interpret this literally, as in, was the earth and the whole of the cosmos created in only 6 days? Regardless of whether or not you favor a metaphorical or a literal interpretation of this passage, I think the argument distracts us from what the real theological takeaway is meant to be. The cosmology, or understanding of the world and the cosmos around us that we see in Genesis 1, reflects a lot of other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies and creation stories, such as the Enuma Elish from Babylonian mythology. However, the core difference between the creation story in Genesis and these other creation stories is that these other creation stories, the world is often created out of spite or out of accident, as a consequence of warring between multiple gods. In Genesis, one God, the God, creates the whole world and the whole cosmos. That is the key takeaway from Genesis chapter 1. And then after creating the whole world, God gives dominion of the earth to humanity, said to be made in God's own image. Moving on to Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 4, we move back in the timeline to before the creation of humanity or even the vegetation of the land. This is why I say that Genesis chapter 2 is a second creation story, rather than a continuation of chapter 1. It's a different perspective and a different story, focusing specifically on humanity itself. God creates Adam from the dust, and then tasks Adam with keeping the Garden of Eden, a place that has everything Adam needs, including the tree of life, but it also has a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warns Adam not to eat from that tree, as the day that he does, he will surely die. God then acknowledges Adam's loneliness, and then brings before Adam all of the animals to see if any of them can be an adequate companion for Adam. Adam gives all of them names, but none of them can truly be a companion to him. God then makes woman out of Adam's selah, often translated as rib, but more literally speaking, the Hebrew word means side. I think the translation of side is appropriate here, because the translation of rib makes the connotation that woman comes from a small part of man, rather than translating it as side, which implies that the two make up equal halves of the whole of humanity. After the creation of Eve, who has not actually been named yet in chapter 2, the two get married and become one flesh. Moving on to Genesis chapter 3, where we see the fall of humanity. The serpent, who is said to be craftier than any of the other beasts of the land, tempts the woman, asking her if she's really allowed to not eat from any of the trees in the garden. He responds, saying that she can eat from any of the trees in the garden, except for the tree in the center of the garden, that she says she can neither touch or eat from, lest she will die. The serpent responds and tells the woman that what will actually happen is that she will gain the knowledge of good and evil if she eats from the tree, and that she will become like God. In their pride and their desire to become like gods themselves, Adam and Eve eat from the fruit of the tree, hoping to gain its knowledge. In a way, the serpent did not lie in order to deceive them. He merely omitted part of the truth. Their eyes were opened to good and evil, and they suddenly felt shame for the first time. In their loss of innocence, they sought to hide their nakedness from God. When God confronts them, Adam first blames his wife, and then his wife blames the serpent. God punishes all three of them for their roles within this sin. But God also speaks of a future time in which an offspring of the woman will bruise the head of the snake, while the snake bruises the heel of the offspring. Because Adam and Eve have now sinned, God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. And the stated reason as to why is to keep Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life. Now, there are multiple ways to interpret this, but the way that I have always taken it is that God is actually being merciful in choosing to remove them from the garden. If they were to eat from the tree of life, now being sinful, then they would live forever in their sin, doing infinite harm to themselves and to others. In this way, removing them from the garden is actually the first step in God's plan for ultimate salvation. Moving on to chapter 4. Cain and Abel are both born. Cain becomes a worker of the land, and Abel a tender of sheep. They both give a sacrifice to the Lord, but the Lord prefers Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. This angers Cain, and in his jealousy, he murders his brother Abel. After the loss of Abel, God provides another son for Adam and Eve, named Seth. Chapter 5 recounts the generations from Adam down to Noah, through the lineage of Seth. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 tell the story of Noah and the great flood. Rather than getting too bogged down in the individual details of this story, I just want to make a couple of overarching points. Like the basic framework of the cosmology that we see in Genesis chapter 1, the story of the flood is not one that is unique to Genesis alone. Most ancient Near Eastern societies had some sort of flood narrative that was part of their self-identity. Because of this, I think the most important lessons to be gleaned from the flood narrative in Genesis can be seen in how it differs from those other ancient Near Eastern stories. In this instance, the core difference between the story in Genesis and many of the other stories is that in Genesis, the reason God floods the earth is because of the wickedness of humanity. In many of the other flood stories, the gods flood the earth either because of their warring amongst themselves, their petty differences, their jealousy, or even in one instance simply because humans are too loud and annoying. The lesson of the story is clear. God desires justice, and justice must be done, but God also desires mercy, which is why God ultimately relents with the flood and promises to never do such a thing on the earth again. After the story of Noah and the flood concludes, the next couple of chapters primarily consist of genealogies spanning from Noah down to Abram. But in the midst of these genealogies, there's one story that stands out, the story of the Tower of Babel. In chapter 11, verse 1, it said that the whole earth comes together and had one tongue. They planned to build a great tower that stretches up to the heavens to make a name for themselves. In response, God notes that this is only the beginning of what they might do if they continue to work together like this, and decides to disperse them, confusing their language and keeping them from working together on this common task. While this story and its placement in the greater text of Genesis can seem quite confusing, it actually acts as a summary of the same themes that have been taught throughout the book so far. If the pride of humanity is left unchecked, then humanity will go on to do abhorrent things. This is exactly why God cast humanity out of the garden and kept them from the tree of life. In the same way, the confusing of their speech, though it may seem at first like a punishment, is ultimately for their own good. Just as keeping humans from the tree of life when they are sinful is ultimately an act of mercy, as I mentioned earlier. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, when the Holy Spirit falls on the church for the first time on the day of Pentecost and allows the speech of all people to be understood by one another again, it is the reversal and the redemption of this moment, which was a symptom of humanity's fall. Moving on to chapter 12 and to the call of Abram. God tells Abram to get up and to leave his homeland, the land of his father's house, and to go to the land of Canaan. And God promises to Abram that if he does this, he will make a great nation out of him, and that his descendants will rule this land. In the latter half of chapter 12, we see the rather odd story in which Abram lies to the Pharaoh of Egypt, telling him that his wife Sarai is actually his sister. He does this out of fear that the Pharaoh of Egypt would simply kill him and take Sarai to be his own wife. Pharaoh takes Sarai to be his wife and is then afflicted with plagues because of this, as Sarai was already married to Abram. Therefore, he was committing adultery. Because of the plagues, Pharaoh relents and lets Sarai and Abram go. When you look at this story on its own, it seems quite odd, especially to most modern readers. But this story serves two purposes, one within the immediate context of Genesis and one within the greater biblical narrative. In the context of Genesis, this story shows us that Abram is flawed. Even though he did listen to God and got up from his homeland to go to the land that God had promised for him and his descendants, when Abram's expectations are not met in the time that he wants them, and he is forced to instead sojourn in Egypt, he tries to take things into his own hands in order to provide for himself. And as we will soon see, this is not the last time Abram makes that mistake. As for how this story fits into the greater biblical narrative, it actually foreshadows the story of Israel itself. Sarai here represents the people of Israel being given over to Egypt when they actually belong to God. God sending plagues, forcing Pharaoh to release Sarai, is a foreshadowing of God sending plagues to force Pharaoh to release the people of Israel in the story of Moses and the Exodus. In chapter 13, God reaffirms the promise that Abram's descendants will be numerous, comparing them to the number of grains of dust on the land. In chapter 14, Abram goes to rescue Lot, who is captured in a war among various city-states, including Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 15, God goes beyond simply promising to give Abram descendants, and makes a true covenant with him, telling Abram that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. When Abram asks for proof that this will indeed be true, God tells Abram to collect some animals and to cut them in half. This may seem like a strange ritual to us now, but in the ancient Near East, this would have been understood as the proper way to seal a covenant or contract. In fact, this sort of ritual is why we have the phrase in English, to cut a deal. Normally, what would happen is that when you cut the animals in half, both parties would walk through the middle of the severed pieces of the carcass to acknowledge they both took responsibility for this deal. But it is important to note that in this case, Abram does not walk between the pieces. Only the presence of God, represented by the flame, passes through. In this way, God is promising to uphold the covenant to Abram, even if Abram does not uphold his end of the bargain. In the very next chapter, chapter 16, Abram and Sarai finally have enough waiting on God and attempt to take things into their own hands. Abram sleeps with Hagar, one of Sarai's slaves, and Hagar gets pregnant with Abram's child. Even though Sarai initially encouraged Abram to sleep with Hagar, Sarai is now upset and banishes Hagar into the wilderness. While fleeing from Sarai and Abram, an angel of the Lord meets with Hagar and asks Hagar to return to them. Hagar listens to the angel of the Lord and returns to Abram and Sarai. She names God El Roi, meaning the God who sees, and names her son Ishmael, meaning God hears. In chapter 17, God appears to Abram again to make another covenant. The covenant, for the most part, overlaps with the first covenant made in chapter 15, except it's a little bit more specific in terms of giving Abram the actual name of his son to be, Isaac, and telling Abram that his descendants will have to be circumcised as a symbol of the covenant between them and God. God also renames Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. At the beginning of chapter 18, 3 men who appear to just be simple travelers at first arrive at Abraham and Sarah's camp. They show these men hospitality, and in return, they tell them that come this time next year, Sarah will be with child. But Sarah laughs at this idea because she believes she is too old to give birth. But the messenger responds by saying that nothing is impossible for God. The latter half of chapter 18 and the whole of chapter 19 tell the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, how Abraham attempts to persuade God not to destroy the cities, but ultimately God does anyway because their wickedness is found to be too great. This story repeats similar themes to that of the flood story with Noah. In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah travel to a new region and meet the king Abimelech. Abraham repeats the same mistake he did with the Pharaoh in Egypt and pretends that Sarah is his sister. However, unlike the story with Pharaoh in Egypt, Abimelech is warned as to what is going on in a dream, and he willingly gives back Sarah without being punished first. In chapter 21, Sarah finally conceives and gives birth to their son, Isaac. Not wanting Abraham's other son, Ishmael, to get any of the inheritance, Sarah asks Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away into the wilderness. Abraham is upset about this for the sake of his son Ishmael, but God tells Abraham to do as Sarah says, promising that there will also be a nation from Ishmael's descendants, as Ishmael is also an heir to Abraham. As Hagar was found desperate in the wilderness, she cried out to God, who answered her prayer, bringing forth a spring of water in the wilderness, so that they did not die of thirst. In chapter 22, we find the infamous story of the binding of Isaac. Here, God asks Abraham to bring Isaac up to the mountaintop and sacrifice him, even though God did not intend for Abraham to actually harm Isaac in any way. Many readers still struggle with this passage, as even suggesting that Abraham would have to sacrifice his own beloved son seems incredibly harsh. Now, from the perspective of the New Testament, we can also say that this text foreshadows the coming sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But even still, this is a difficult text to grapple with, and I don't want to simply explain it away easily. I believe that texts like this one are meant to challenge us, and that we are actually meant to wrestle with them. More on that in a minute. Moving on to chapter 23. Sarah dies, and Abraham buries her in the land of Canaan. In chapter 24, Abraham is also approaching death, so he sends a servant back to his homeland of Mesopotamia in hopes of finding someone to marry his son Isaac. God guides the servant to meet Rebekah at a well, who turns out to be a suitable match. Rebekah also happens to be Isaac's cousin, but that was pretty commonplace back then. After Rebekah comes back with the servant and meets Isaac, the two get married, and this comforts Isaac as he is still mourning the loss of his mother. In chapter 25, Abraham dies at peace in his old age and passes on all his belongings to his son Isaac. Later in the chapter, Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. God tells Rebekah, contrary to the normal order of things at the time, that Jacob, the younger son, will be the one to receive the inheritance. At the end of the chapter, Esau ends up selling his birthright to Jacob over a bowl of stew, because he believes he was so hungry he was about to starve to death. In chapter 26, God speaks to Isaac and warns him not to go down to Egypt. Isaac goes to make a deal with King Abimelech to stay in his land. In chapter 27, we find that Isaac is getting old and is approaching death, so he wishes to bless his firstborn son, Esau. But his eyes are no longer good, and he can't see very well. So Rebekah and Jacob form a plot to trick Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. The plot succeeds, and Jacob is able to receive the blessing from his father Isaac. But this is the final straw that breaks the relationship between Esau and Jacob that was already quite thin. Not wanting to kill his brother while his father was still alive, Esau promises that after his father's death, he will kill Jacob. In chapter 28, both Jacob and Esau are sent off to find wives. Esau ends up marrying a woman who is a descendant of Ishmael, and Jacob goes to a place known as Luz, and he receives a vision from God in which the promises that God made to Abraham are repeated to Jacob. He gives glory to God for the sake of this vision, and decides to rename the place Bethel, which means house of God. In chapter 29, Jacob, still seeking to find a wife, meets Laban, who has two daughters, the older named Leah and the younger named Rachel. Jacob falls in love at first sight with Rachel, believing her to be beautiful, but Laban also wants to get Leah married off. Laban ends up tricking Jacob into sleeping with Leah when he believes he's sleeping with Rachel. Jacob ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel, but he prefers Rachel. God sees the plight of Leah and takes pity on her, opening her womb so that she can bear children, while keeping Rachel's shut. Leah gives birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. This leads to a competition between the 2 sisters in chapter 30 as to who can provide more sons to Jacob. Rachel is still barren, so she gives over her servant Bilhah to Jacob to have babies on her behalf. Jacob ends up having 2 sons with Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. In response, Leah gives over her servant, Zilpah, who has 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. Later on, Leah bears 2 final sons for Jacob, Issachar and Zebulun. She also has a daughter named Dinah. Finally, after all of that, Rachel will have her own son named Joseph. Rachel will have a final son named Benjamin, but we'll get to that in a few chapters. After working for Laban for many years and the birth of all of these children, Jacob decides it's time to go off on his own. Laban is initially upset by this and feels betrayed, but eventually him and Jacob work it out. In chapter 32, Jacob finds out that Esau is coming to meet with him with a group of 400 men. And Jacob is scared because he believes that Esau intends to kill him and his whole household. Jacob splits his house into 2 camps so that if one of them is attacked, the other one will be able to escape. And he prepares a gift to send to Esau, hoping that that will stay his wrath. That night, Jacob wrestles with a mysterious man. At daybreak, after winning the wrestling match, Jacob asks the man to bless him. The mysterious figure renames Jacob, giving him the name Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. Names carry a lot of meaning, especially in the particular culture and historical context in which this book is written. Giving the name Israel to Jacob, and ultimately to the whole people of God. This story can teach us an important lesson about how we are meant to interact with God. I do not believe that we are meant to have a faith that exists on blind trust alone, but to have a faith that is built on bringing our doubts and our questions to God, or, in another way, to wrestle with God. In chapter 33, Jacob finally comes face to face with Esau, and he believes that this could end violently. But instead, Esau runs to him and embraces him, and the 2 finally reconcile. In chapter 34, a man named Shechem defiles the daughter of Leah, named Dinah. Jacob says that if Shechem wants to marry his daughter, then he will have to get circumcised along with their whole household. While all the men of their household are recovering from the circumcision, Dinah's 2 brothers, Simeon and Levi, killed all the males of Shechem's household. In chapter 35, God once again blesses Jacob and reaffirms his new name of Israel, as he still was going by Jacob. Later on in the chapter, we see that Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to her second and final son, Benjamin. In the very end of the chapter, we see that Isaac also dies and is buried by his 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, finally reconciled. Chapter 36 tells us the genealogy of Esau, and in that way, the origin of the land of Edom. Chapter 37 is the beginning of the 3rd and final act of the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. Now, Joseph is the older of the 2 sons of Rachel, and Joseph is said to have been Israel, or Jacob's, favorite son. Israel shows this favoritism by giving him a long, colorful robe. Now, Joseph's many brothers envied him because he was his father's favorite. Additionally, Joseph had multiple dreams in which he said he saw visions of his brothers bowing down before him, which only made them hate him even more. Eventually, his brothers got so fed up with Joseph that they conspired against him, wondering if they should kill him. But they decided there would be no money in that, so they instead sold him into slavery, where he would eventually end up in the service of Potiphar, a captain in the guard of Pharaoh. Chapter 38 tells an odd story about Judah and how he tries to marry off 2 of his sons to the same woman, Tamar. But both of them die, and in the end, Judah himself ends up sleeping with Tamar and having 2 sons with her. Chapter 39 returns to the story of Joseph. Joseph becomes a servant in Potiphar's house, but he slowly works his way up to the point where he becomes the overseer of the whole household. This is until Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her. Joseph refuses, But after time and time again of trying to do so, she eventually steals part of his garment. She uses this garment as evidence that Joseph tried to sleep with her and blames it on him, and that gets Joseph thrown into prison. But even when he is in prison, he still rises to be somewhat of an overseer within the prison, showing God's favor in his life, even in the darkest of times. While Joseph is in prison, he meets two other prisoners that have dreams that they want to have interpreted, and Joseph offers his services, saying that God gives the interpretations of dreams. The first dream is that of the cupbearer. In the cupbearer's dream, there's a vine with 3 different branches, and the grapes ripen quickly, and the cupbearer squeezes the grapes into the cup and gives it to the Pharaoh. Joseph interprets that the 3 branches represent 3 days, and after 3 days, Pharaoh will take the cupbearer out of prison and restore him to his services. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember Joseph and to tell Pharaoh that Joseph is stuck in prison and has done nothing to earn his place there. The chief baker's dream was similar. He had 3 cake baskets on his head, and in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked goods for the Pharaoh, but there were birds eating out of the basket on his head. Joseph responded and told him that the interpretation was this: the 3 baskets represent 3 days, just like for the cupbearer. But in this case, in 3 days, the Pharaoh will take the baker and he will hang him on the tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from him. Both of Joseph's interpretations end up coming true. But even though the cupbearer is restored to his former position, he forgets about Joseph and never puts in the good word for him. In chapter 41, we learn that 2 years have passed, and suddenly Pharaoh has a dream that he needs interpreted. The cupbearer finally remembers about Joseph, and he tells the Pharaoh about the Hebrew man that he met in prison who was able to interpret dreams. So the Pharaoh sends for him to get an interpretation. The Pharaoh's dream is this: he sees 7 cows that are plump and attractive, that came up from the Nile, and they feed on the reed grass. But then after that, there are 7 other cows that come up after them, poor, ugly, and thin, such as that he had never seen in all the land of Egypt. The thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But even after they had eaten them, no one would have known they had eaten, because they were still ugly and thin. Joseph does indeed have an interpretation for Pharaoh, but he makes sure to note that the interpretation does not come from his own power, but by the grace of God. Joseph's interpretation is this: the 7 good cows that are fat represent the next 7 years in Egypt's history, in which there will be plenty of food in the land. But the 7 ugly, thin cows that will come after represent 7 years of famine that will follow the next 7 prosperous years. So Joseph recommends that they must take time to store up as much surplus grain as possible, as to be ready for the time of famine. Pharaoh is pleased with this answer, so he puts Joseph in charge of managing the food supplies for the next 14 years. 7 years later, Joseph's prediction comes to pass, and a great famine falls over the land. But thankfully, Joseph had already filled huge storehouses of grain, and all the people of Egypt, and even beyond, came to Joseph to receive grain from him. In chapter 42, we see that in the land of Canaan, the famine is also there, and so Joseph's brothers are sent by Jacob, their father, to go to Egypt to attempt to buy some grain. When Joseph's brothers arrive, he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. Despite how wicked they were to Joseph, Joseph shows them mercy and fills their bags with grain and even puts their money back in their satchels. But he requests to see Benjamin, the last of his 11 brothers, and the only other brother from his mother, Rachel. But when the brothers return to Canaan and to their father Jacob, and tell them about the man who wants to meet Benjamin, Jacob says that Benjamin cannot go, because he cannot risk losing his last son from Rachel. In chapter 43, Jacob and his sons once again run out of food, and are forced to return to Egypt to get more. But Joseph's brothers must convince their father to allow Benjamin to come with them, because they told him that they could not return without bringing Benjamin, as that was Joseph's request. So the father relents and allows Benjamin to go. He also sends them with some more presents and with double the money from before, including the money that had been returned to them the first time. In chapter 44, Joseph tests his brothers. by sending them back once again with their money returned to them, with all the food they need, and this time with his own personal silver cup in the bag that belonged to Benjamin. Then Joseph sent one of his servants to go after the brothers and to act as if the cup had been stolen, saying that he would punish the one who stole the cup. When they all go through their bags and it is revealed that it is Benjamin's, the brothers go back to plead on Benjamin's behalf. In chapter 45, it finally gets to be too much for Joseph to keep up the act, and he professes that he is indeed their brother. They do not recognize or believe him at first, but Joseph explains what happened, and how even though they had sold him into slavery, this was all actually part of God's greater plan, so that they would not perish in the great famine to come. What they had meant for evil, God had meant for good. So Joseph sends all of his brothers back with plenty of supplies. They return to their father and tell him the good news that Joseph lives. This revives their father, and with this new spirit, he sets off towards Egypt to see his son before he dies. Chapter 46 gives an updated genealogy of the generations from Jacob down to the sons of Joseph. Chapter 46 also recounts the reunion in which Jacob returns to see Joseph in Egypt, where Jacob says that he can now die at peace because he has seen that his son Joseph is alive. In chapter 47, Jacob and his whole family settle in the land of Goshen, and they grow to be successful shepherds and farmers. At the end of chapter 47, we see that Jacob is near death, and so he calls his sons to him to give them a final blessing, and to request that they take his body to be buried in the land of his fathers. In chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, but he gives the greater blessing to Ephraim, even though Ephraim is the younger of the two, repeating the same thing that happened between him and his brother Esau, where the younger received the greater blessing, contrary to the normal order of things at the time. In chapter 49, Jacob calls all of his sons together to bless them one final time before his death, though not all of the sons receive a positive blessing. Jacob says to Reuben, the firstborn, that because he is unstable, he will not have the typical preeminence of a firstborn. To the brothers Simeon and Levi, he says that they are too violent, and because of this they will be divided up and scattered. To his son Judah, Jacob says that his house will be like a lion, royal and strong. To Zebulun, he says that his people will dwell by the sea and work with ships. Issachar is said to be like a donkey, who will serve and do hard labor. To his son Dan, it is said that his house will judge the people. To his son Gad, it was said that he would be attacked by raiders. To Asher, that his food would be rich. To Naphtali, that his words would be beautiful. Joseph is said to be set apart from his brothers and to be greatly fruitful. Finally, Benjamin is ominously referred to as a ravenous wolf. After giving each of these blessings, Jacob breathes his last and is brought back to be buried in the land of his fathers, the land of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And at last we come to Genesis chapter 50, where Joseph and his brothers keep their promise to their father Jacob, and they bring him back to the land of Canaan to be buried, in a time of great mourning across the whole of Jacob's household and of Egypt. Eventually, Joseph returns and lives out the rest of his days in Egypt, till he dies in his old age and is buried there. His descendants will go on to live in Egypt, as all the descendants of the Hebrews will, for many generations, until the time of Moses. At the end of Genesis, we see that Joseph reunites with his brothers, and all of them continue to prosper in the land of Egypt, until eventually a new Pharaoh takes over leadership. And this Pharaoh is jealous of the people of Israel, and he is afraid that they are growing too strong and does not want them to overtake the Egyptians should their enemies try to fight them from the outside and the Israelites rebel from the inside. And so the Pharaoh prepares plenty of hard labor for the people of Israel. He forces them to do heavy burdens, to build store cities for the Pharaoh, in Pithom and Ramesses. Yet as he continues to oppress the people, they continue to multiply and become even more successful. Because of this, the Pharaoh acts even more ruthlessly towards the people of Israel and makes them to work as slaves, to work in a bitter and hard service in both brick and mortar and all kinds of work in the field. Now, I do want to note, although the text does refer to some brick and mortar building, it is a common misconception that the Hebrews worked on the pyramids. Although we do not know the exact timeline as to when this event, where Moses and the Hebrews are attempting to escape from Egypt, takes place, it is very likely somewhere between the 1500 to 1200 BC range, whereas the pyramids of Giza were built around the 3000 BC range. So whatever it was that the Hebrews were building, it was not the pyramids. However, this slave labor proved to still not be enough to stop the Israelites from prospering. And so the Pharaoh sets out to end the generation of Israelites by telling the midwives to kill any of the sons that are born of Hebrew women. But the midwives fear God, and they do not listen to the Pharaoh. And when the Pharaoh asks why they did not listen, they say that it is because the Hebrew women are too strong, and they give birth before the midwives even arrive. God blesses the midwives for their refusal to take part in this treachery. But Pharaoh continues to order that all of the sons of the Hebrews be executed and thrown into the Nile. Eventually, a man from the house of Levi marries another Levite woman, and the two of them have a son. The mother is able to hide the son for up to 3 months, but eventually she can hide him no longer. And so she makes a basket out of reeds and bitumen and pitch, and he puts the child in it among the reeds of the riverbank. Eventually the child floats down the river and is found by the daughter of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter has pity on this child, and after he has been nursed, Pharaoh's daughter takes him as her own son and names him Moses, which sounds like the Hebrew word for draw out, for she has drawn him out of the water. When Moses had grown up, he sees the plight of his own people, the Hebrews. And one day, when he sees an Egyptian who is beating one of his fellow people, he murders the Egyptian and hides his body in the sand. The day after, he sees 2 Hebrews who are fighting with each other, and he says, "Why do you strike your companion?" But the Hebrew says, "Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Once Moses realizes that his murder did not go unseen, he fled from Egypt. And when Pharaoh found out about it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses was already gone, and he stayed in the land of Midian. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and the 7 daughters were attempting to get water for their flock, but were being harassed by other shepherds. Moses ends up helping these 7 daughters, and in return, the priest of Midian asks that Moses would come and break bread with them. Moses ends up marrying one of the 7 daughters, named Zipporah, and has a son with her named Gershom, which means sojourner or foreigner. Moses is content to remain in Midian, but the people of Israel continue to groan and cry out in their state of slavery. And God hears their groaning and remembers the covenant made with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. One day, while Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, he came into the wilderness of Horeb, the mountain of God, and an angel of the Lord appeared to him in flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and he saw that while the bush was burning, it was not consumed. Out of the bush, God called to him, said, "Moses, Moses, here I am. Do not come near and take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And the Lord tells Moses that he is going to free the people of Israel. But Moses, in response, gives a series of excuses or reasons as to why he's not the right person for the job, to which God answers each one in turn. Moses' first excuse is simply to ask, "Who am I to deliver God's people out of Egypt?" To which God responds, "But I will be with you, Any negative qualities that Moses may have are negated, because as long as God is on his side, anything is possible. Moses' second excuse is to say, "What if the people of Israel ask me what your name is? What will I say?" To which God responds, "I am that I am." The divine name, also known as the Tetragrammaton, or the YHWH, is derived from the Hebrew word to be. Whenever you see in an English Bible the name Lord in all capital letters, Lord, it is signaling that the Hebrew word being used there is the Tetragrammaton, rather than the literal Hebrew word for Lord, which is Adonai. This is because when the scripture would be read aloud, the name of God was not to be said aloud. So whenever they would get to the point of the name of God, they would read aloud Adonai, even though that's not what it says on the page. Although this is technically the moment in which the divine name is introduced into the biblical story, the divine name is actually used all throughout most of Genesis. Moses' third objection is to say that the people will not believe him or listen to his voice, to which God responds by allowing Moses to throw his staff down and having it turn into a snake. And when he picks it back up, it turns back into a staff. This miracle is to serve as evidence that God did indeed meet with Moses. But in case that sign is insufficient to prove to people, God also says that he may put his hand behind his cloak, in which it will turn leprous, and when he does it again, it will turn back to normal. Or that he could pour out water from the Nile, and that it would turn into blood. Moses objects yet again, saying, "But I am not an eloquent speaker, and I am slow of speech and tongue." God responds, "Who is it that made man's mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" Out of excuses, Moses makes one last desperate plea and simply requests that God send someone else. This angered the Lord, but God still allows Moses to have his brother Aaron as his mouthpiece, saying that Moses will be the mouthpiece for God and Aaron the mouthpiece for Moses. Moses finally relents with all of his excuses and asks Jethro, his father-in-law, if he may return to Egypt. After Jethro says yes, Moses takes his family and begins the trip back to Egypt. But along the way, while they are staying somewhere, we are told that God intends to kill Moses for some reason, which is not explicitly given. But we are then told right afterwards that after Zipporah circumcises their son, God relents and leaves Moses alone. While it seems quite odd that right after sending Moses on this mission, God nearly kills Moses before he even makes it to Egypt, I think that the point of this story is to show us, one, the importance of circumcision, but also it shows us the faithfulness of Zipporah and her willingness to do what God says, even though she herself is of Midian and not an Israelite. This theme of foreigners at times being more faithful to God than Israelites will come up multiple more times throughout the Bible, and we will address it later. When Moses and Aaron finally arrive before Pharaoh and ask for him to let the people of Israel go out into the wilderness for 3 days to make a sacrifice to their God, Pharaoh responds that he does not know this God, and he will not let the people go. And instead, he is angered by Moses and Aaron's proposition, and so he forces them to work even harder, increasing the amount of work they have to do to produce bricks, and not even providing the straw for them. In this way, in the immediate, the situation gets even worse for the people of Israel, and Moses relents, asking God why he was sent there in the first place if things were only going to get worse for Israel. Despite the initial reaction of Pharaoh, God promises that the people of Israel will be delivered by the mighty hand of God. God speaks to Moses and says, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, El Shaddai. I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians have held as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the burden of the Egyptians, and deliver you from slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will make you my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you from the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you into the land that I swore to your fathers. After a bit more complaining from Moses about how Pharaoh would not listen to him, and reading the genealogy of Moses and Aaron, the two of them appear before Pharaoh's court once again to attempt to convince him to let the people of Israel go. Despite the signs that Moses and Aaron perform, Pharaoh's heart remains hardened, and he will not relent and let the people of Israel go. As for this whole question of Pharaoh's hardened heart, and whether or not it is hardened by God or hardened against God, it has become a major talking point in the theological debate about free will and God's sovereignty. Did Pharaoh choose to act unjustly, or was Pharaoh merely predetermined to act in the way that he did? And for that matter, do any of us choose to act unjustly, or are we predetermined to do so? I do not have an easy answer for you, but instead I encourage you to hold those two ideas in tension as we continue through the rest of the story. Because Pharaoh does not relent and allow the Israelites to go, the Lord inflicts the first plague upon the people of Egypt, turning the water of the Nile into blood. This makes it so that the Egyptians cannot drink the water, and a foul stench rises up from it. The next couple of chapters follow the same pattern, where Moses and Aaron come to plead before Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he refuses to relent. And then another plague happens. Chapters 8 through 10 describe the following plagues. The second plague is a plague of frogs that invades the homes of the Egyptians, and specifically goes into their ovens and kneading bowls, disrupting the processes of making bread. The third plague was one of gnats, something that even the magicians of Egypt were not able to recreate, and so they told Pharaoh this must be the finger of God, but Pharaoh's heart remains hardened. The fourth plague is one of flies that was said to only affect the people of Egypt and not the people living in the land of Goshen, the Israelites. Pharaoh pleaded with Moses to stop this plague and even said that he would allow them to go a short ways away into the wilderness to make their sacrifices to the Lord. But after the flies disappear, he goes back on his promise. The fifth plague was the killing of the Egyptian livestock, and yet the livestock of the people of Israel remained. The sixth plague was one of boils, and the seventh plague, hail. Just as with the plague of flies, Pharaoh originally says that he will let the people go, and then once the hail stops, he goes back on his promise yet again. The eighth plague was one of locusts that consumed the crops of the Egyptians, and the ninth plague, a plague of darkness that fell over the land for 3 days. Only the land of Goshen had light for the people of Israel. After the ninth plague, Pharaoh once again almost relents, saying that the people of Israel can go, but their flocks and their herds must remain behind. When Moses says they must have them, for they need animals for their sacrifices, Pharaoh says, "Get away from me, for if I see your face again, you shall die." To which Moses responds, "As you say, I will not see your face again." The 10th and final plague is warned ahead of time, as it is by far the most consequential: the death of every firstborn in the land of Egypt. This is said to stretch from the firstborn of the throne of Egypt all the way down to the firstborn of the cattle. Chapter 12 begins by giving the instruction for the practice and celebration of the Passover, before even retelling the actual story of the 10th plague and of the exodus of the people of Israel. This event marks the beginning of the Jewish calendar, and is said that in this month, on the 10th day, each household is meant to take a lamb according to their father's house, and if the household is too small for a lamb, then they will gather with their nearest neighbor to together have a lamb. And on the 14th day of the month, the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will kill their lambs at twilight, and they will take the blood of the lambs and put it on the doorposts. And they will eat of the flesh of the lambs, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They are not to eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, and none of it should remain until the morning. Anything that remains in the morning should be burned. Following the memorial of the Passover, the people of Israel are said to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, and they shall remove the leaven from their households. This is said to be a statute and a day of remembrance, so that the people of Israel would never forget that the Lord their God delivered them from Egypt. Finally, the Lord fulfills the promise, and at midnight the Lord strikes down the firstborn of all the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and even the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh rises up in the night, he and all his servants, and with a great cry he summons Moses and Aaron, and says, "Up and go out from among my people. Take your people and go to serve the Lord, as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone." And so the people of Israel left, and they ate unleavened cakes of dough, because they were brought out of the land of Egypt so quickly that they did not have time to wait for their bread to leaven. This is the purpose of eating unleavened bread in remembrance of the Passover, to remember that the people of Israel left in a hurry, without time to prepare for the journey. After this, the Lord told Moses to consecrate all of the firstborn children. And the people of Israel followed God, and they went the path that God set before them. They followed a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, and they went around the land of the Philistines, lest they see war and desire to return to Egypt. But as the people of Israel are still wandering about in the wilderness, the Pharaoh is hardened one final time and decides to go after the people of Israel and hunts them down in the wilderness. As the people of Israel are chased down by the army of Pharaoh and his chariots, they initially believe that they stand no chance of survival and cry out to Moses, lamenting as to why they left Egypt if it was just to die anyways. But the Lord commands Moses to stretch out his staff, and he parts the Red Sea with a strong wind from the east. And the people of Israel march across dry ground. But when the armies of Egypt attempt to follow them, the water encloses on them and destroys the whole army. The first 21 verses of chapter 15, known as either the Song of Moses, the Song of Miriam, or sometimes just the Song of the Sea, may initially just look like a celebratory song that retells the story that was seen prior to it. But in reality, it is likely the other way around. The Song of the Sea reflects an older version of the Hebrew language than the prose of the chapters around it. This is because, at the time, the process of writing was a lot more complicated than we often think of it as in the modern world. Most of the biblical stories, especially in the early parts of the Old Testament, began as oral traditions before they were ever transferred into the Hebrew text. Because the easiest way to remember and to pass down oral traditions is to put them in song form so they can be more easily memorized, the oldest oral traditions often are found in songs. This is a theme that we will continue to see throughout the rest of the Bible, but especially in the books of the Old Testament that recount the history of Israel. What this means is that whenever you see instances of songs while you're reading the Old Testament, and those songs tell the same story as the prose that surround it, most likely the song is older than the prose, and the prose is an expansion and a collection of other oral traditions that expand on the story that the song itself tells, as is the case here with Exodus. In chapter 16, the people complain to Moses that they are going to die of hunger, and once again say they would have been better off staying in Egypt, because at least they would have been full. But the Lord says that he will provide manna for them, manna from heaven, and that he will give it to them each day, except for the Sabbath day. And on the 6th day, they will receive a double portion, so they have enough to not have to work on the Sabbath. Even though the people of Israel continued to grumble and complain about various things, God provided for them each time they needed. When they needed water, God provided water. When the people of Israel came up against the Amalekites, God provided victory for them. Eventually, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, meets them while they are out wandering in the wilderness, bringing Moses' wife and his 2 sons with him. Moses greets him with kindness and with a kiss. And after talking with his father-in-law Jethro, he receives the advice that he should no longer be trying to arbitrate all of the community's problems on his own, but rather to appoint others to act as judges for the sake of the community. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had left Egypt, they finally came to the wilderness of Sinai, where they made camp, while Moses went up the mount to commune with God. God makes a promise to Moses, saying that so long as they follow their covenant and keep the promises, then the people of Israel shall be treasured among all people, and they would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Then God also gives instruction to Moses to share with the people of Israel in order to keep themselves safe in the presence of the holiness of the Lord, when the Lord is to come down and to give them their covenant. Then the Lord speaks to the people of Israel and gives them the 10 Commandments, beginning by saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. First, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or on the earth below. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, where you must not work. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, or their wife, or their servants, or their ox, or donkey, or anything else that belongs to their neighbor. A couple of things to note about the 10 Commandments. Only 3 of the 10 Commandments are about things you should do, while the other 7 are about things you shouldn't do. The 3 things that should be done are fairly straightforward: worshiping the Lord God alone, remembering the Sabbath, and honoring your parents. Now, what exactly it looks like to remember the Sabbath will be a debate for rabbis all the way through the time of Jesus and even unto today. But otherwise, these 3 commands are fairly straightforward. Not taking the Lord's name in vain is not really in reference to being a potty mouth, but rather about taking oaths in the name of the Lord and not being true to the oaths you're making. The commandment not to murder is a Hebrew word that can also include non-voluntary or non-intentional deaths that are caused by negligence, so similar to what we would consider in English manslaughter. What is clear is that God is not asking the people of Israel to be complete pacifists, as there are plenty of instances in which God either allows or even commands for killing to take place. The 10th commandment, not to covet your neighbor's things, is sort of a combination between not stealing and not committing adultery, while also saying that you shouldn't even attempt or think about taking those things, let alone just acting on it. After the Lord has given the 10 Commandments, God once again reaffirms that the people of Israel are not to make gods of silver or gold, and then gives them some instructions as to how to act in terms of altars and burnt offerings. Across the next couple of chapters, more laws are added to the covenant with God. Rather than going through each of the laws listed individually, I will just say that the general theme of the next couple of chapters is the theme of restitution. If one person wrongs another person, then they are due some sort of compensation for restitution of that wronging. One law that I do want to note from these chapters, as this theme will continue to come up later on throughout the Hebrew Bible, is the idea that the people of Israel should not oppress the foreigner or the sojourner that dwells with them. And the reason behind that is because they understand what it's like to be a sojourner in a foreign land, for they were mistreated when they were in Egypt. In the latter half of chapter 23, God details the coming promise of the land of Canaan and allow them to defeat the Canaanites currently in the land. After making these promises to the people and giving the laws that the people of Israel must follow, the covenant is confirmed, and God tells Moses to come up the mountain in order to receive tablets of stone with the commandments for the people of Israel. Over the next several chapters, God details all of the things that Moses needs to pass on to the people of Israel in regards to the building of the tabernacle, the courtyard, the Ark of the Covenant, and the priestly garments, as well as the rules for consecrating priests. The Israelites got impatient, waiting for Moses to return from the mountain. And in their impatience, they asked Aaron to make them gods to go before them, to which Aaron gathered up their various pieces of gold jewelry, melted them down, and created a calf made of gold. When Moses returned down the mountain to the people of Israel, he was furious and threw and broke the tablets of the testimony given to him by the Lord. Moses called any who were faithful to the Lord to his side, in which he was joined by the sons of Levi. He then commanded them to go out and kill some of the ones that had disobeyed God, to which they did. And for their willingness to blot out this transgression, Moses told them that today they had been ordained for the service of the Lord. After the debacle with the golden calf, the Lord commands Moses to take the people and go up to the land of the Canaanites. But the Lord also warns Moses that they will be on their own. But Moses goes to the tent of meeting and intercesses with the Lord. Moses says to God that if the Lord does not go with them, then they cannot go. The Lord agrees to Moses' request. And then Moses also asks to see the glory of the Lord, to which the Lord responds that he can only see his back, for he cannot see the full face of his glory. After Moses' intercession with the Lord, the people of Israel and the Lord God are reconciled to one another. And Moses is told to make new stone tablets and bring them back to Sinai, so that there can be new tablets of testimony. The covenant is renewed before the people. And when Moses returns from the Mount Sinai, his face is shining with the glory of the Lord. With the people reconciled and the covenant reinstated, Moses again reminds the people of Israel to remember the Sabbath, and then asks for contributions for the construction of the tabernacle. The next few chapters detail the construction of the tabernacle, the courtyard, and the various pieces that go within the courtyard and the tent itself. This is my attempt at an at least relatively to-scale model of the tabernacle and the courtyard. The materials are not all correct, and they're not intended to be. I simply wanted to give a sense of scale as to roughly how large this would have been. In the courtyard was an altar for burnt offerings, as well as a bronze basin for the woman who ministered at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Past the first veil into the holy place, there is a lampstand made of pure gold on the left, and on the right, a table for the bread of the presence. Just before the second veil that enters into the Holy of Holies is the altar of incense. Beyond that second veil, in the Holy of Holies, lies the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the tablets of the testimony, the stone tablets that were given to Moses from Mount Sinai. After detailing the creation of the tabernacle and all of the parts of the rest of the courtyard, once again the details of the priestly garments and their construction are outlined. In the final chapter of Exodus, the Lord speaks to Moses and gives him the instruction that on the first day of the first month they shall erect the tabernacle, and gives him the information as to how to do it each time. The book of Exodus ends with the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle, such that even Moses cannot enter the tent of meeting. Throughout all their journeys, wherever they would go, the cloud would be taken up from the tabernacle, and the people of Israel would set out and follow the cloud. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night. Unlike the first two books of the Bible, Genesis and Exodus, which are primarily narrative-driven books, Leviticus primarily describes the various aspects of the priesthood and of the sacrificial system within ancient Israelite religion. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus are dedicated to explaining the various types of sacrifices. Chapter 1 describes the laws for burnt offerings. There are multiple types of animals that can be used for burnt offerings, but the general rule is that it should be a male without blemish. They are brought to the tent of meeting, where they are drained of blood, broken apart, and the whole animal is to be burned in the fire, without the people eating any of the meat. While it is not made explicitly clear in this passage the difference between why you would sacrifice a bull versus a sheep or goat or a bird, It is likely meant to be tied to the financial standing of the person giving the sacrifice. In this agrarian society in which money does not work the same way that it does in the modern world, someone who was able to sacrifice a bull would have been understood as somebody who was vastly more wealthy than someone who was only able to sacrifice a pigeon or a turtle dove. Essentially, God is giving the people instruction for each of them to give a sacrifice according to their means. But regardless of how much an individual has to give, the purpose is that they are giving the whole offering to God by burning the whole animal. The purpose for burnt offerings in chapter 1 of Leviticus is left unclear. The burnt offering of the bull is tied to the idea of atonement for sin, but the other two offerings described of goats and sheep, or pigeons and turtle doves, is not directly tied to atonement. I believe this is because burnt offerings are a more general subsection of offerings that contain atonement offerings as a type of burnt offering. Essentially, all atonement offerings are burnt offerings, but not all burnt offerings are for atonement. Chapter 2 details grain offerings. Unlike with burnt offerings, grain offerings have only a small portion of the offering burned on the altar, whereas the majority of the offering actually goes to the priests, the sons of Aaron. The main distinction made with grain offerings is that any grain offerings that are burned on the altar are meant to be made without leaven or honey, and they are meant to be salted, with that salt being tied to the salt of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. Chapter 3 describes the laws for peace offerings. Peace offerings look a lot like whole burnt offerings, but the exception is that 1. The animal can be either male or female, whereas burnt offerings are said to only be for males. And 2. The peace offerings do not have the whole animal burnt. Only the fatty bits of the animal are removed and then burnt on the altar. It's not explicitly stated what happens to the rest of the animal, but presumably if it's not burnt on the offering table, that means that the people eat the rest of the animal. Therefore, the people are essentially sharing this meal with God, or they are in communion with God. Chapters 4 and 5 detail the laws for sin offerings and guilt offerings. Sin offerings are explained to take place much like peace offerings, where the fat and the entrails are removed and burned on the altar of the Lord. But rather than the rest of the animal being then eaten by the worshiper, the animal is taken outside the camp and is burned outside the camp. The end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6 describe the laws for guilt offerings. Guilt offerings appear to be a type of sin offerings in which the sin is committed directly against another person. This is why restitution is demanded to be given back to the person that was wronged, as well as a ram and a fifth of the value of the ram being given to the priest. So there is an element of both seeking forgiveness and restitution from the person who was wronged directly and directly to God. In the beginning of chapter 6, it is stated that the person should go immediately to restore what they took from the other person through robbery or oppression, and then make an offering to the priest. This is consistent with the New Testament understanding of when Jesus tells somebody if they have sinned against a brother, that they go and make restitution with that brother before making an offering to the Lord. The remainder of chapter 6 describes the practical instructions for the priesthood as to how to actually carry out burnt offerings on the altar. For example, how long to let the animal burn on the altar and what to do with the ashes after that's done. Chapter 7 essentially re-summarizes all of the different types of offerings described in the last 6 chapters and gives specific instructions about what parts of the animal and which specific types of offerings that the priests are allowed to eat of. It also elaborates on some specific types of peace offerings, for example, an offering of thanksgiving. Chapter 8 returns to a narrative structure and tells the story of the consecration of Aaron and his sons. Moses gathers the whole congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting for the consecration ceremony. Moses washes and then dresses Aaron and his sons with the dress that is described as being created in the book of Exodus. They are then anointed with oil, and multiple sacrifices are done to the same description as they were given in the past 7 chapters, including a sin offering of a bull, a burnt offering of a ram, and an ordination offering of another ram. This ordination offering appears to be a special type of burnt offering, done for the purpose of ordaining Aaron and his sons as priests. After all the offerings and ritual were completed, the glory of the Lord appeared to the people of Israel, and fire came down to consume the burnt offering pieces. And when the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. In chapter 10, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, give some sort of strange or unauthorized offering before the Lord did not command them to do. And because of this, the fire comes out of the altar and consumes them. Though this seems incredibly harsh, Moses describes to Aaron that this is because the Lord says, "Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified." Essentially, God is holy and cannot be in the presence of sin, which highlights the purpose of this sacrificial system in the first place, being to provide reconciliation between the people of Israel and God, so that they can be in God's presence. Chapter 11 covers clean and unclean animals. The general rule given for which animals are clean, which animals are unclean, is that clean animals have a parted hoof and cloven feet, and they chew cud. But animals that only do one of those things are not clean. For example, pigs, camels, and hares. Any fish that has scales is clean, but any creature of the sea without fins and scales is unclean. So something like an eel. Several birds are listed as unclean, although the Hebrew words for these various birds, we're not entirely sure what species they actually refer to. But generally speaking, it appears to be that most, if not all, birds of prey are considered unclean. Most winged insects are said to be unclean, with the exception of locusts and grasshoppers. It's important to note that with the food laws, as well as many of the other laws that are culturally distinctive to Israel, their purpose was to keep the people of Israel set apart from the other nations, or the Gentiles. And one of the ways in which this was done was keeping it so that they didn't eat the same type of food as the Gentiles. An example of where we can see this dynamic about how the food laws actually govern the relationship between Israelites and foreign nations can be seen in the book of Daniel. We'll cover that dynamic more directly when we get to the book of Daniel. One more thing I want to say about the basic concept of clean versus unclean, because this theme is going to continue to pop up throughout the rest of Leviticus, is that there is a difference between somebody being ceremonially unclean and somebody being guilty of sin. Israelites regularly became ceremonially unclean for doing things that were not sinful. This is because tons of necessary actions, such as touching a dead body of somebody who needed to be buried, results in becoming ceremonially unclean. And then there's a prescription as to how to cleanse oneself and the time period in which one remains unclean after something happens. The point is, just because somebody does something to become unclean, and that prevents them from doing certain things in relation to the sanctuary, that does not mean that what they did is actually sinful or bad. In many cases, it's actually the thing they were supposed to do. Keeping that idea about cleanliness in mind, Chapter 12 tells us the laws around purification after childbirth. After giving birth, a mother becomes unclean for a certain period of time. After that time is up, the mother is meant to go to the sanctuary and to make an offering for her atonement. This is not because the act of childbirth is sinful, but rather that giving birth to children does make one ceremonially unclean within the sanctuary or temple structure. Chapter 13 tells us the laws about leprosy. Now, it is important to note that the word in Hebrew that refers to leprosy here, and the same in Greek in the New Testament and the Septuagint, are general terms that can refer to multiple different types of skin conditions. Leprosy today in the modern medical community refers to a very specific bacterial infection. But in the biblical context, leprosy was a broader term that referred to a collection of skin conditions. Essentially, in this chapter, multiple different circumstances in which the skin disease is either minor and goes away quickly, or not really a problem at all, or contagious to others. The person is immediately deemed clean or clean within 7 days. It's only if it is a serious and chronic condition that the person is for a long time forced to live outside of the camp and to declare to all others that they are unclean whenever they come near to them, socially and physically ostracizing them from the community. It is a terrible fate, and it is why stories in the New Testament in which Jesus heals people with leprosy are often so impactful, as he's not only healing a physical ailment, but an ailment of social ostracism that is oftentimes even worse than the physical pain. Chapter 14 tells us the laws of what a person is supposed to do after they have recovered from a skin condition, and what to do if a house has had leprosy in it. Chapter 15 tells us the laws about bodily discharges and how those cause people to be unclean. Chapter 16 returns to the narrative structure and tells the story of the institution of the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement takes place once a year in the 7th month and the 10th day, in which the people are to fast and Sabbath of all work. The high priest performs a special sin offering in which 2 goats are taken, and one is burned in the way that a normal sin offering would be done, and the other one, the hands of the high priest are laid on them, and the sins of the people are transferred onto the goat symbolically, and then the goat is let go to run out into the wild. This symbolizes that the sins of the people are being placed on the goat, who takes their blame. This story is also the origin of the phrase scapegoat. In chapter 17, we return to looking at some more laws and regulations around sacrifice and practice. In this case, there are laws about the proper place to do sacrifices and laws against eating blood. Chapter 18 tells us about several unlawful sexual interactions, such as relations with a family member or with an animal. Chapter 19 begins with a reassertion of the holiness of the Lord, and then goes on to list several other miscellaneous laws afterwards. The middle section of the chapter focuses on laws that ensure justice for the poor and marginalized, such as the commands to leave some of your vineyard for the poor and the sojourner or the foreigner, that you shall not steal or deal falsely, that you shall not oppress or rob your neighbor, and that you shall pay the worker the wages they deserve, and ultimately that you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Chapter 20 details the various punishments for some of the sins that were listed earlier. The sins listed here are primarily more heinous sins, such as child sacrifice and extreme forms of sexual immorality, in which the punishment is generally death. The point being made is that there is a high standard for the holiness expected of the people of Israel because God is holy. And in order to be in communion with God, the people of Israel must be holy. Chapter 21 details holiness laws that are specific to the priesthood, such as how priests are only allowed to bury immediate family and not allowed to touch dead bodies of people outside their family. And the high priest is not even allowed to bury members of his own family. Chapter 22 continues elaborating on more laws for priests, and then also talks about some things about acceptable and unacceptable offerings. Chapter 23 details many of the important feast days. This includes the Passover, the Feast of the First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths. Chapter 24 begins by explaining some of the details about the lamps and the bread in the tabernacle. Then a story is told about a man who blasphemes God and is punished to death for it. And the chapter ends with a section that teaches an ethics of an eye for an eye. The tension between the themes of retribution and mercy will continue to come up throughout the rest of the Bible. Chapter 25 tells us about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. Just as the people are to rest on the 7th day of each week, they are also to rest for a full year on the 7th year. And then after 7 sets of 7 years, 49 years, the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee is set aside as holy, and it is a year of economic redemption. Land is returned to its ancestral owners, and land that is bought or sold must be done at a fair price. In the midst of this chapter about property and it being sold back and forth for fair prices, chapter 25 reminds us, all the land and all that there is belongs to God, not to the people of Israel, nor to any of us. Chapter 26 shows the dichotomy between the blessings if the people of Israel are obedient, and the curses if they are disobedient. The blessings of God are primarily tied to the fruitfulness of the land, and the curses of God are primarily tied to the lack of fruitfulness. Finally, we come to the last chapter of Leviticus, 27, which focuses on various offerings and their worth in shekels, as well as doubling down on the idea that one must not break their vows to the Lord. Beginning with chapter 1, we see a census of Israel's warriors. Each of the 12 tribes, with the exception of the Levites, who do not go to war, as they instead have priestly duties, put forward their able-bodied men as soldiers, in case the need for conflict arises. While the exact number of soldiers from each tribe is not all that important, what is notable is the tribe that has the least number of soldiers put forward, which is that of Manasseh, and the tribe with the most soldiers, which is Judah. This lines up with what we know about how these tribes will turn out later on, as Judah will grow to be the largest and most powerful tribe, the seat of the monarchy, and Manasseh is said to be the smallest tribe. Chapter 2 continues the census and explains where each of the tribes set up camp around the tabernacle. There is a note that each of them should set up their camps facing towards the center, towards the tent of meeting itself, and not away from the tent of meeting. The first half of chapter 3 lists the members of the tribe of Levi, and each of their clans, and what the role for each of those clans is within the tabernacle. The end of chapter 3 tells an interesting story about the redemption of the firstborns. God says to Moses that rather than taking the firstborn of each family in the household of Israel, the Lord instead takes the entire tribe of the Levites. The only problem is that there are 22,000 Levites, and there are 22,273 firstborns. So the Lord tells Moses to collect 5 shekels for each of the 273 firstborns that are over and above the number of Levites. While this may seem odd, and at first glance seems like the human beings are being valued at 5 shekels each, it's not quite that simple. The point being made here is that the firstborns of the people of Israel should belong to God as a part of God's covenant with them. But God has instead chosen for the people of the tribe of Levi to belong to him, and to be the servants of the tabernacle. The redemption price essentially stands in for the firstborns of the people of Israel, because the terms of the covenant that the Lord made with the people of Israel must be properly fulfilled. And since the redemption price from the people of Israel goes to the Levites, it also acts as a way for the people of Israel to support the priesthood, as they are set apart for the holy work of God. And because of this, they depend on the rest of Israel to provide for their well-being. Chapter 4 continues to expand on the duties of the various clans of the tribe of Levi, specifically focusing on the duties of the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. The beginning of chapter 5 reminds us of the laws around uncleanness and cleanness, and guilt offerings and confession, which we discussed during Leviticus. After being reminded of these laws, we are told about a process in which a priest is meant to mediate between a husband and a wife, in which the husband is accusing his wife of adultery. But there is no proof that the wife actually committed adultery, merely the accusation. Essentially, the priest makes the woman to swear that she did not commit this adultery, and then drinks of a bitter drink. If the woman is telling the truth, then the bitter drink will do nothing to her. But if she is lying and she has committed adultery, then the bitter drink will cause her to become infertile. While this may seem confusing or strange to us, essentially the point that is being made is that if there is no one to corroborate a story, or a judge cannot find justice between two people who are saying opposite things, but in reality only one of them can be true, then it is up to God, who knows all, to do the judgment. Chapter 6 details the laws of the Nazirite vow. The word Nazirite means separate or set apart. A person who takes a Nazirite vow is not supposed to eat any grapes, fresh or dried, or drink any wine, nor are they meant to have any vinegar. They are also meant to not cut their hair until the completion of the time of their vow. For the duration of their vow, they are also meant to stay away from dead bodies. At the conclusion of their vow, the Nazirite gives a special offering to the priest and to the Lord. This offering is inclusive of multiple other types of offerings: burnt offerings, sin offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings. Chapter 6 ends with Moses telling Aaron and his sons, the priesthood, to give this blessing to the people of Israel. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Chapter 7 tells the story of the consecration of the tabernacle and the offerings that were given by various people on the day that it was consecrated. Chapter 8 mainly covers some practical instruction for the Levites, including the ritual process for purification, in which they are to cleanse themselves before doing work in the temple, and information about their retirement. The Levites are called to work from the time they are 25 years old until the time they are 50 in the tent of meeting. In the modern Western world, that doesn't sound like too bad of a retirement age, but trust me, there are still plenty of things about the ancient world that made life pretty difficult. The first half of chapter 9 details the Passover celebrated in the second year that the Israelites left Egypt. In this narrative, it is also explained that becoming unclean from touching a dead body should not prevent someone from celebrating the Passover. The second half of chapter 9 talks about the tabernacle and the cloud that covered the tabernacle during the day and the fire that covered it by night. And whenever the cloud stayed over the tabernacle and did not leave, the people of Israel would remain there. But wherever the cloud moved and the Lord commanded, the people of Israel would take the tabernacle and follow the cloud and the presence of the Lord. In the second year and the second month, on the 20th day, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle, and the people of Israel were told to leave Sinai. The people set out in stages, and each group was responsible for caring for a certain portion of the tabernacle. For example, it was the sons of Gershon who carried the main bulk of the tabernacle, and the Kohathites that carried the holy things. And as the company of Israel traveled, the Ark of the Covenant went before them. At the beginning of the next chapter, the people of Israel immediately begin to complain as they are traveling in the wilderness. First, they complain about the lack of food, longing for the time that they had in Egypt, where they had melons and leeks and fish to eat. But now they only had manna, and they were dissatisfied with the manna. The anger of the Lord is kindled against the people of Israel for their ungratefulness, until Moses prays on their behalf, and the anger of the Lord is settled. Then Moses pleads to the Lord, saying, I cannot deal with these people that you have given for me. And so the Lord gives Moses instruction to appoint elders to help him share the burden of keeping watch over the people. This story is in many ways a microcosm for the entire experience of the people of Israel and Moses with the Lord during their time in the wilderness. The people of Israel complain or do something wrong. The Lord grows angry for that and tries to punish them. Moses pleads to the Lord to have mercy on them. The Lord shows mercy. Moses gets upset about the people, and so the Lord helps Moses cope with the people. This same basic concept will be repeated several times throughout the rest of Numbers and Deuteronomy. Chapter 12 tells the story about when Miriam and Aaron attempted to oppose Moses and his leadership. Although they specifically criticize him for being married to a Cushite woman, it seems like that's probably not what they actually had a problem with. because the point they make is that the Lord has also spoken to them, therefore they should also be listened to. It seems like pointing out Moses' marriage to the Cushite woman is more of them grasping at straws for something to attack Moses' character, because they wanted to demean his leadership, not because their main problem was with his actual marriage. The Lord brings the three of them to the tent of meeting to deal with this conflict. God speaks to Miriam and Aaron and tells them that Moses is not like the other servants of the Lord. Most of the time, the Lord speaks in riddles, visions, and dreams. But to Moses, the Lord speaks plainly. After this interaction, Miriam is punished with 7 days of leprosy. Aaron is not punished with leprosy, but we are also told that Aaron immediately seeks forgiveness for this action and says that they have done foolishly and sinned. We are not told what Miriam's response to this is, but because she was punished and Aaron was not, and they are both said to have participated in speaking out against Moses, the story seems to imply that Miriam was not repentant while Aaron was. Either way, the people of Israel remained where they were for the next 7 days while Miriam was shut outside the camp. And when she was ready to be brought back in, they set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. In chapter 13, the Lord speaks to Moses, telling him to send out men to the land of Canaan to spy on the land and report back on what they find. When the spies returned to the people of Israel after 40 days, they told the people that the land was flowing with milk and honey and had great fruit. But they also warned that the land was full of enemies. Only Caleb suggested that they go up at once and occupy the land, for with the strength of the Lord they will be able to overcome it. But the other spies said, "No, we must not go up, because that is a land that devours its inhabitants." And the enemies they saw were of great height, descendants of the Nephilim, so tall that they made themselves look like grasshoppers. In chapter 14, we see the reaction of the people of Israel. The whole congregation cries out and proclaims that they wish they would have either died in Egypt or at least somewhere out here in the wilderness, because it would be better than dying by the sword in Canaan. Only Joshua and Caleb had the bravery to step forward and go into the land of Canaan as God commanded. Just like the pattern I pointed out before, after the people complain, the Lord grows angry, but Moses intercedes on behalf of the people. Though the Lord relents and shows mercy to the people despite their disobedience, God still says that none of the people of this generation will get to actually enter the land that was promised to their descendants. The only exceptions being Joshua and Caleb, the only two faithful spies that went into the land and were brave, knowing that the Lord would provide for them. At the end of the chapter, some of the people go out and get into a fight, expecting that God will still protect them, even though Moses warned them that they were going without the protection of the Lord, and they were defeated by the Amalekites and the Canaanites that lived in the hill country. Chapter 15 acts as a break in the narrative structure to give some more laws about sacrifices, unintentional sins, Sabbath breaking, and tassels to put on your garments to remember the commandments of God. Chapter 16 tells the story of Korah's rebellion. Korah, a Kohathite of the tribe of Levi, gathered together dissenters of his own tribe and the tribe of Reuben. They assembled themselves together against Moses and Aaron, saying they had gone too far, and calling into question their leadership and their favor with the Lord. Moses responds to this rebellion by essentially saying, "Well, then let's test to see who God stands with." Moses then asks the Lord to either side with him or the people of Korah, to which the earth opens up and swallows those who rebelled with Korah, taking them directly to Sheol. Now, I don't want to spend too much time getting into the concept of Sheol now, as I plan to cover it more deeply in a future video. But for now, just understand that the basic concept is that the Lord provided a unique and clear sign of judgment on those rebelling against Moses. In chapter 17, the Lord speaks to Moses and tells him to gather staffs from each of the 12 tribes of Israel and have them put into the tent of meeting. God then causes Aaron's staff of the tribe of Levi to bud while the rest of the staffs remain normal, proving once again to the congregation that the Lord sides with Moses and with Aaron, and that it is Aaron's sons that will form the priesthood. Chapter 18 goes on to list some of the duties of the priests and the Levites. Chapter 19 details laws for purification if someone becomes ceremonially unclean. Chapter 20 is a major turning point in the Pentateuch, where we see the downfall of all three of our major heroes: the death of Miriam, the sins of Aaron and Moses that prevent them from coming into the Promised Land, and the death of Aaron. Miriam dies at the beginning of the chapter, in the wilderness of Zin, while the people stayed in Kadesh. Miriam died and was buried there. Sometime after the death of Miriam, the people of the congregation were upset at the lack of water, so the Lord tells Moses to go to the rock and command water to come out of it. And so Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and the water came out abundantly. Because of this, the Lord speaks to Moses and Aaron and says that because you did not believe me and uphold me as holy, you shall not bring the assembly into the land that I have given to them. At first glance, it can seem difficult to see what Moses and Aaron actually did wrong. They performed a miracle, and they caused the water to come out of the rock, just as the Lord told them. But they did not perform the miracle in the way that God instructed. The Lord told Moses to tell the rock to bring forth water for the congregation, not to hit it with the staff. But even if they performed the miracle incorrectly, what about this mistake made the sin so egregious that they were prevented from entering the Promised Land? While I won't say with certainty what the exact reason is, there are a few potential reasons that in combination might explain why he got such a harsh punishment. The first reason is merely that Moses disobeyed a direct command from the Lord. As we were told earlier during the incident of Korah's rebellion, Moses does not hear from God like the other prophets through visions and dreams that can be misinterpreted. Moses hears directly from God, and therefore the standard of him doing what God has told him to do is higher, even than the prophets. Another potential reason, and perhaps the explanation I see most often, is that the way Moses performed this miracle was such that he was taking credit for the miracle himself, rather than giving the credit to God. This argument is largely based in verse 10, in which Moses says, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water out of this rock?" While it is potentially true that Moses was not correctly applying credit here, I don't actually think this is the primary sin that he committed. This is mainly because, when the Lord is speaking back in verse 8, God says, "So you shall bring water out of the rock and give them drink to the congregation and their cattle." If God is speaking to Moses in a way that still somewhat attributes the miracle to Moses, then I don't think that Moses saying "we" is the primary thing that he did wrong there. Ultimately, I think the primary sin that Moses commits here relates to the staff itself. God tells Moses to take the staff with him to perform this miracle, but does not tell Moses to hit the rock with it. All throughout the Pentateuch, God instructs Moses to perform certain miracles with his staff. The staff is a holy artifact that God has given to Moses to bear as a symbol that God has chosen Moses to lead the people. Holy objects, such as those in the tabernacle, like the Ark of the Covenant, have certain rules about the way they are meant to be used and not used. And to profane or defile those objects by using them in a way that you're not supposed to is, in a way, profaning the holiness of God. I believe this is why the Lord says to Moses and Aaron in verse 12, that you did not uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Essentially, Moses did not just disobey the Lord, but he did so in a way that directly profaned a holy object that was given to him to bear as a symbol that he was chosen by God to lead the people, profaning a holy object, and in that way profaning the holiness of the Lord before the whole congregation. But whatever the reason may be, this moment is the downfall of Moses, and the reason that he is not allowed to enter the Promised Land himself. After the sin at Meribah, the people of Israel continue on, but they are stopped at the edge of the land of Edom, who does not allow them through. Sometime after that, we are told that Aaron dies there at the edge of the land of Edom, and that the whole people mourn for him for 30 days. After a fairly disastrous part of the story in chapter 20, chapter 21 lists several of Israel's victories. They defeat Arad, the Canaanite king of Negeb, King Sihon, leader of the Amorites, and King Og of Bashan. While this is a chapter in which Israel mostly does what it's supposed to, there is still the incident of the bronze serpent. While the people were attempting to go the long way around by the Red Sea and avoid Edom, the people grew impatient and once again complained about the lack of food and water. Because of this, the Lord sends serpents against the people, to which they recognize their mistake and ask for mercy from the Lord. God then instructs Moses to make a bronze staff of a serpent, and that any who look upon it will be cured if they had been bitten by a snake. This story is referenced by Jesus in John chapter 3 during his conversation with Nicodemus. But we'll cover that and how this story relates to the overall arc of redemption once we get to that gospel. Chapters 22 through 24 tell one of the most interesting stories in the Bible, the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. Balak, the leader of the Moabites, saw what the Israelites had done to the Amorites and feared for his own people. So he sent messengers to go meet with Balaam, who had a reputation for being able to curse people or bless people, and whoever he did so to, it actually came true. Balak wanted Balaam to curse the people of Israel so that he would be able to defeat them. Balaam listened to the Lord and denied the first group that asked him to come back to Balak with him. But when the second group came, he went along with them. And an angel of the Lord appeared on the road before Balaam on his donkey. The donkey saw the angel, but Balaam himself did not see the angel. 3 times the donkey attempted to avoid the angel of the Lord by veering off to the side, and on the final time by simply laying down and not moving forward. After each time, Balaam grew angry and hit the donkey. After this 3rd time, the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she began to speak to Balaam. The donkey reminds Balaam that she is the same animal that he has ridden upon his whole life, and that she has never treated him poorly, implying that if she is going the wrong way now, there must be a reason for it. After acknowledging what his donkey had said was true, the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing before him. Realizing what he had done wrong, Balaam fell down on his face before the angel of the Lord and pleaded for mercy. The angel of the Lord then tells Balaam that he should be grateful for his donkey, for she has just saved his life. Balaam says that he will turn back and not go to the king of Moab, but the angel of the Lord tells him to continue with the journey. But rather than saying what Balak wants him to say, Balaam will say what the Lord instructs. In the next few chapters, Balak tries 3 times to get Balaam to curse the people of Israel, but all 3 times he instead ends up blessing them, explaining to Balak that he cannot say what the Lord has not commanded him to say. After blessing the people of Israel 3 times, Balaam does one final oracle that is a curse on the people of Moab and some of the other Canaanites. In the end, Balak's attempt to curse the people of Israel ends up backfiring on himself. This whole story highlights an important and repeating theme of the Old Testament, which is that the Lord fights for Israel, even when Israel doesn't realize God is fighting those battles. Moses and the other people of Israel have no idea that the king of Moab is attempting to curse them, and yet God uses this mysterious prophet Balaam to bless the people of Israel and to prepare their way as they come to the Promised Land. In chapter 25, we find the people of Israel committing adultery with the daughters of Moab and sacrificing to their gods as well. The connection between the sins of adultery and idolatry is prevalent all throughout the Old Testament. To punish the people for these sins, the Lord sends a plague on Israel, which is only ended when Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, chases down and pierces 2 people that had committed this sin with a spear. In chapter 26, after the plague was resolved, Moses and Eleazar took a new census and found that none except Moses, Joshua, and Caleb were still alive from the generation that had left from Egypt, and only Joshua and Caleb would go on to see the Promised Land. The first half of chapter 27 addresses a question as to what happens to the inheritance of someone if they die and they have no sons. This question comes up because the daughters of Zelophehad come to Moses and say that their inheritance has been given to their uncles when it should belong to them. Moses brings this case before the Lord, and God confirms that the inheritance does belong to the daughters. The second half of chapter 27 explains that it will be Joshua that succeeds Moses, and that he will lead the people of Israel into the Promised Land. Chapters 28 and 29 give some more details about various types of offerings, including various offerings for feast days, such as the Passover and the Feast of Weeks. Chapter 30 gives instructions concerning vows taken by both men and women. If a man vows to do something, then he shall not break his word. And in most cases, if a woman vows to do something, she is not to break her word either. However, if her father or her husband attempts to nullify that vow, she no longer bears responsibility for it. And if her father or her husband learns of her vow and decides not to do anything about it, but then later on prevents her from keeping her vow, then they will bear responsibility for the broken vow. In chapter 31, the people of Israel go to war against the Midianites. Their conquest is successful, yielding a great amount of plunder. And in the fight, they also happen to kill Balaam, the same prophet that actually ended up blessing the people of Israel. In chapter 32, the tribes of Reuben and Gad settle in the land of Gilead, to which Moses is initially upset, saying that they are being cowardly, not helping the rest of the tribes of Israel to occupy the Promised Land. But the people of Reuben and Gad promise that they will set up fortified cities here, but they will still go out to war on behalf of the other tribes and help them to take the rest of the Promised Land. But after that is done, they will return here, for their inheritance is on this side of the Jordan. Chapter 33 recounts the whole journey from Ramesses in Egypt all the way here to the plains of Moab by the Jordan, and looks ahead to the time in which the people of Israel will cross the Jordan and enter the land of Canaan. Chapter 34 describes the boundary lines of the land, and also lists the tribal chiefs that belong in each section. Chapter 35 describes the inheritance that belongs to the Levites, and also describes cities of refuge. Cities of refuge are cities that are designated to be places in which somebody who has committed a crime, specifically here manslaughter, that they can go to this city to take refuge and await a congregation to give a judgment on the situation. So, for example, if someone kills somebody but does so accidentally, they can flee to this city of refuge and wait for the congregation to look at the facts of the case and decide whether or not they have committed manslaughter, and they can be forgiven, or if they have committed murder, and they too shall be put to death. Finally, we come to chapter 36, the final chapter of Numbers. In this chapter, we return to the question of the daughters of Zelophehad and their inheritance. The brothers of Zelophehad, who had the inheritance taken for them to be given to the daughters, complain that if the daughters marry someone outside of their tribe, then the inheritance will leave their tribe's lineage and go to that other tribe instead. Moses agrees that this is a problem, so he tells the daughters of Zelophehad that they can marry whoever they wish, but it must be within the tribe of their father, the tribe of Manasseh. This sets the precedent that inheritance is not meant to go back and forth between tribes, but rather that the inheritance will remain within the tribe that it began. The book of Deuteronomy acts as a summary for the first 4 books of the Pentateuch, as well as concluding the story at the edge of the Promised Land, and explaining the law once again in a way to prepare Israel for the future time while they are living in the land. While parts of Deuteronomy may seem repetitive, the main purpose of the book is to show how the law can be applied in a time in which the people of Israel are no longer wandering in the wilderness, but will be instead settled in the promised land, and without the leader they've had thus far, Moses. Chapter 1 gives a summary of the whole journey thus far, from Israel's original departure from Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, to the point in which they refused to enter the promised land because of the negative report given by the spies, to which the people of Israel were afraid because of the strength of the enemies in the land, and they did not believe in the Lord God to provide a way for them. As a penalty for this rebellion, God decided that everyone of that generation would perish, and only the next generation would take the promised land, the only exceptions being Joshua, who would be their next leader, and Caleb. Chapter 2 summarizes their wilderness years wandering after God had already decided that none of that generation would pass into the promised land. This includes their peaceful time in the land of Esau and the land of Moab, as well as the time they had to go to war against King Sihon, who would not allow the people of Israel through his land. Most of chapter 3 details the conflict with King Og of Bashan, in which, similar to the Amorites, the Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel, except in this case, two of the tribes, the tribe of Reuben and the tribe of Gad, actually ended up laying claim to some of that land. The end of chapter 3 discusses why Moses was forbidden to enter the promised land. Interestingly, Moses, the speaker in this part of Deuteronomy, does not tell the story of Meribah and the rock pouring out water because of him hitting it with the staff as the reason that he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land, but instead says that the Lord prevented him simply because of the people of Israel themselves, as if Moses was sinful simply because he, as the leader, was responsible for their disobedience, rather than his own personal sin preventing him from entering. Either way, God instructs Moses to go up on top of the mountain and to look over in all directions to see the land, for he shall not cross the Jordan himself. Chapter 4 begins with Moses imploring the people of Israel to listen to and follow the law of God, that they take care to remember God's commandments, and that they pass them on along with the stories of the great wonders God did for them in delivering them from Egypt, down to their children and their children's children. The next section details the sin of idolatry and why it is forbidden. This section is important because it highlights something that often goes unnoticed, which is that idolatry is not merely about worshiping other gods by worshiping idols of those gods, but also that you are not to make a carved image or likeness of God, because to do so is an act of blasphemy. Moses reminds the people that they did not see a form on the day that the Lord spoke to them in Horeb, and because they did not see a form of the Lord, they should not make a carved image in any likeness, male or female, of any animal on the earth, of any winged bird of the air, anything that creeps on the ground, nor even of any of the things in the heavens, the sun, the moon, and the stars. This is because all of these things are part of creation, and to try and make a carved image that represents the Lord would be inherently limiting who God is. Essentially, God does not have a form. God is the one who forms. And so the Lord does not want any idols carved to attempt to act as an image of God, because nothing else in creation can act as the image of God, for the Lord has already created humanity itself to be God's own image. And so these idols are nothing more than lifeless hunks of metal and stone. The next section talks about how the Lord alone is God, reminding the people of Israel of all the great miracles that God did for them, and proclaiming that the Lord God has no equal in heaven or earth. The end of the chapter lists 3 cities of refuge on the east side of the Jordan and introduces the law. Chapter 5 repeats the 10 Commandments from Exodus chapter 20 in a slightly different wording. Most of the language used is identical from the Deuteronomic version to the Exodus version, with the exception of one commandment in which the wording has changed fairly significantly, the fourth commandment about the Sabbath day. The Exodus version of the Sabbath commandment says to remember the Sabbath day, while the Deuteronomic version says to keep the Sabbath day. This isn't a massive change, but it does change the focus from merely remembering and recognizing the importance of the Sabbath to keeping and holding fast to the actual laws of it. The more significant change, though, is actually in the reason in which the people are meant to keep the Sabbath. In Exodus, it's explained that the Lord labored for 6 days making the heaven and the earth, and then rested on the seventh day, and that's why the Sabbath is blessed and sanctified. However, in Deuteronomy, it's explained that the reason for keeping the Sabbath is to remember the time that Israel spent as slaves in the land of Egypt. By observing the Sabbath day, they are commemorating the time that they were in bondage, but that the Lord freed them from that bondage. In chapter 6, Moses gives the people of Israel the greatest commandment, known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. This commandment is at the heart of the law, and as Jesus states in the Gospel of Matthew, the whole law and the prophets can be summed in this one commandment. Though Jesus also adds a second part to the commandment, to love one's neighbor as oneself, as Jesus teaches in the New Testament that to love one's neighbor as oneself is to love God. But we'll get more into that when we cover the Gospels. The rest of chapter 6 gives instruction for how parents are meant to pass on the stories and the commandments of God to their children, and to remind the people that they are not to test the Lord your God, another aspect of Deuteronomy that Jesus calls upon when he is tempted by Satan in the wilderness. Chapter 7 explains that the Israelites are God's chosen people, and it is for that reason that they will be able to conquer the promised land, even though they will be fighting against armies that are greater and stronger than they. They will be able to succeed because they have the Lord on their side. God also warns the people not to intermarry or intermingle with the people of Canaan, for if they do, they will end up turning away and following their gods instead. This, too, will continue to be a major recurring theme throughout the rest of the Old Testament. In chapter 8, God tells the people of Israel to remember the Lord their God and all the ways that God had provided for them while they were in the wilderness, and warned them not to forget about what the Lord had done once they reached the land of plenty, when they have good houses to live in and herds and flocks that multiply. Their coffers are full of silver and gold, and they are tempted to say that it is by their own hands that they have gained all this wealth, and not because of the blessing of the Lord. In a similar vein, chapter 9 explains that Israel is not crossing the Jordan to conquer the promised land because of their own righteousness, but rather because of God's faithfulness to the covenant made with Abraham, and because of the unrighteousness of the people already in that land. Similar to the discussion we had back in Genesis about Noah's Ark, where I explained that the flood narrative was a common Near Eastern idea. But the significance and difference of Israel's version of the story is that the reason for the flood, rather than being the pettiness of the gods, is actually the unrighteousness of the people. In a similar vein here, it's explained that the reason for conquering is not simply for plunder or pettiness, but because of unrighteousness and the faithfulness of God's covenant. Although this does not completely explain away any difficulties one might have with the violence that we can see both here in the Pentateuch and especially in Israel's conquering of the land in the book of Joshua, it is still notable to see these explanations in relation to how they would have been viewed by their ancient Near Eastern counterparts. In the latter half of chapter 9, Moses reminds the people of Israel of all the times that they were unfaithful, starting with one of the most egregious examples, that of the golden calf. Chapter 10 begins by retelling the story of the second set of the tablets of testimony and how they were placed in the ark. after Moses had prayed for the forgiveness of the people of Israel before the Lord. The end of chapter 10 explains that the people of Israel need to circumcise their hearts, meaning opening their hearts to love the Lord their God. In this section, God also repeats the command for the people of Israel to love the sojourner, and the reason given is that they themselves were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Chapter 11 continues to expand on the commandment to love and serve the Lord. Essentially, God promises them that if they keep the commandments, then things will go well for them in the land that God promised to them. But if they do not keep the commandments, then things would not go well. Even though the Lord would not go against the covenant made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that did not mean that some of the people of Israel would not still suffer for their wrongdoing. But despite the many times that Israel turned away from the Lord, and indeed the many times that all of humanity has turned away from God, God still kept up the covenant made with Abraham, a promise to ultimately redeem all humanity through the nation and the descendants of Abraham. Chapter 12 is all about proper and improper worship. God explains that when they enter the promised land, they are to destroy and dispossess all of the places and altars in which the Canaanites worshipped their gods, and to destroy all their idols. At the end of the chapter, God explains again that idolatry is not just about trying to worship other gods, but also worshiping the Lord improperly by using idols or even child sacrifice. Rather than using idols and pillars in high places, the people are meant to worship the Lord wherever God commands them to go, and there they will bring their sacrifices and their tithes and their offerings. Chapter 13 explains that the people should be on guard for others who are trying to sway them to leave the Lord their God and go after other gods instead. Whether it be a prophet or a dreamer, a stranger, or even a close family member, if any of them tell you to leave the Lord your God and instead go after other gods, then you must not listen to them, and instead hold fast to the Lord God. Even if a prophet performs a sign or a wonder and then tells you to follow other gods, you are not to listen to them. For the sign or wonder they performed was a test from the Lord God to see if you would go after those other gods. The first half of chapter 14 explains clean and unclean foods once again, more or less repeating what we read earlier. There is one notable law, though, that I did not mention the last time we covered it in Exodus. There's a command to not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. There are a few different theories as to what exactly the point of this commandment is. Some argue that it's about not mistreating or acting cruelly towards your animals. Others say that this practice of boiling a goat in its mother's milk was part of an ancient Canaanite ritual of worship, and so the Lord was trying to tell Israel not to do that similar kind of worship. But either way, it was eventually later interpreted as meaning not to mix meat and dairy together, and is the reason why kosher food laws for Jews today prevent you from combining meats and cheeses. The second half of chapter 14 details the tithes. Notably, it's explained here that the tithe that is set aside is not only to be for the Levites, who have no inheritance of land of their own, but also for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, meaning that the tithe is not only to support the people who minister in the house of God, but also for all the people who have need. Chapter 15 explains the sabbatical year, in which every 7 years you are meant to free anyone who is in your service and cancel any debts that a brother owes to you. The chapter also explains that everyone has a responsibility to help their brother if they fall on hard times. Chapter 16 repeats the instructions for the various feast days, such as the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. The chapter ends with a section about justice and the appointment of judges, and forbidding using an Asherah for the sake of worship. We'll talk more about Asherah later on, as it becomes a serious problem during the monarchic period of Israel's history, but for now, just know that it was a form of Canaanite worship that God did not want the people to do. Chapter 17 begins by reminding the people not to sacrifice animals with a blemish, nor to go after other gods or worship the heavenly bodies. There is then a section about complicated cases in which the local judge is unable to determine who is right and who is wrong in a given situation, and the protocol they are meant to follow to bring that up to a different judge of the Levites. The chapter ends with an interesting section about laws concerning kings. Kings are warned not to acquire many horses for themselves, to return to Egypt, to take many wives, or acquire excessive silver and gold, to make sure they have a copy of the law approved by the priests, and to read it all the days of his life. Of course, each of these things that future kings are warned not to do, they end up doing. Most famously with Solomon, whose downfall will come from taking many wives and obsessing over wealth. The collection of horses, a sign of military strength and depending on one's own military might rather than the help of the Lord, as well as going down to Egypt, may refer to Josiah, whose downfall came when he went to war against Egypt when God told him not to. Chapter 18 once again reminds the people that they are responsible for providing tithes and for taking care of the Levites, because the Levites have no inheritance on their own. The chapter goes on to describe abominable practices which Israel is forbidden from doing, including child sacrifice, divination, sorcery, and necromancy. The chapter ends with Moses telling the people that one day the Lord will raise up another prophet like himself, and that the people are to listen to him. It is this passage that Peter references in Acts chapter 3, proclaiming Jesus as the prophet that Moses spoke of. Chapter 19 begins by repeating the laws about cities of refuge, then explaining that it's unlawful to move your neighbor's landmark, essentially trying to steal their land, and ends by explaining that one witness is not enough to convict somebody of a crime, but depending on the crime, it requires 2 or 3 witnesses. Chapter 20 explains the laws concerning warfare, which will come especially into play as the people enter the land of Canaan. The people are instructed to utterly destroy the Canaanites, so that they are not tempted to go after their gods and follow them instead. Chapter 21 lists a number of miscellaneous laws, including instruction for an atonement sacrifice if there is an unsolved murder, the inheritance rights of firstborns, and ends with explaining that someone who receives the death penalty and is hung on a tree is considered cursed by God. This idea will be picked up later by Christians in a way of understanding the atonement that Jesus does for us on the cross. Chapter 22 explains more miscellaneous laws, including how if you find a brother's animal that has gone astray, or their garment, or anything else that they have lost, then you have a responsibility to return it to them, or the responsibility to keep it safe until the brother comes looking for it if you do not know who they are or where they live. The latter half of the chapter includes laws about sexual immorality, mainly concerning the sin of adultery, and giving protections for women who are falsely accused of adultery when they have not committed so. Chapter 23 begins by explaining those who are excluded from the assembly of God. Notably, though the Ammonites and the Moabites are to be excluded from the assembly, treatment of the Edomites and the Egyptians is to be much better, as the Edomites are considered their brothers, the descendants of Esau, and the Egyptians are to be respected because they were a sojourner in their land, and an Edomite or an Egyptian of a 3rd generation may enter the assembly of the Lord. But no one that is the descendant of the Ammonites or the Moabites may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. The rest of the chapter goes on to give multiple more miscellaneous laws, including a law to harbor escaped slaves, to not charge interest on loans to a brother, and that if you are in your neighbor's vineyard, you can eat of their grapes, but you are not to take any with you in a bag. Essentially, do not take advantage of your neighbor's hospitality. Chapter 24 describes even more miscellaneous laws, including laws about divorce, a law providing that a man who is newly married does not have to go out to war for at least a year, and various laws about not oppressing hired workers or the poor or the needy. Chapter 25 lists various other laws, perhaps most notably the laws concerning Levirate marriage. A Levirate marriage is one in which someone dies without having a son to continue on their name, and so their unmarried brother has the responsibility of taking his late brother's wife as his own and continuing the name of his brother's house. Though this might seem quite odd to most of us in the modern world, this was a fairly normal practice in antiquity, and it speaks to the importance of family lineages and their names continuing. Chapter 26 is the last chapter that lists the laws for the people, and it ends by reminding the people about the offerings of firstfruits and tithes. That every third year, the harvest year and the year of the tithe, they shall go to the priest in the place of worship that the Lord their God has determined. And they shall give up the firstfruits, the first tenth of their crop, and they shall say, "A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly, and humiliated us, and laid on us hard labor. And we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of the land of Egypt, with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given to me." In chapter 27, Moses instructs the people to build an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, commemorating the giving of the law to the people. Then Moses tells the people to affirm that a number of sins will cause them to be cursed, such as anyone who makes a carved image shall be cursed, or anyone who sheds innocent blood shall be cursed. In chapter 28, Moses explains that the people will be blessed if they are obedient to the law, but they will be cursed if they are disobedient to it, and that ultimately if they are disobedient, then the Lord will scatter them and send them out of the land that they were promised. In chapter 29, Moses once again recalls the whole story of how the people of Israel got to where they are in Moab, and there God's covenant with Israel is renewed. In chapter 30, God explains that even if the people have sinned greatly, and they are scattered to the ends of the earth and even the far edges of heaven, that should they repent and turn back to the Lord their God, then God will show them mercy and bring them back to the land of their fathers and gather them together once again. The Israelites are given a choice, the choice between life and death, the same choice that Adam and Eve were given in the garden, to follow God or to deny God. But for now, there was still a question as to how Israel would respond to that choice. In chapter 31, Moses names Joshua as his successor and commissions him to lead Israel into the promised land, as well as telling the priests, the sons of Levi, to commit to a reading of the law at the end of every 7 years, in the time of the Feast of Booths, so that all the people of Israel may hear the law read aloud to them, and that they may remember it and keep it in their hearts. In chapter 32, Moses sings a song to the people of Israel that summarizes part of their journey to where they are and proclaims the holiness and strength of the Lord, intending to encourage them as they go off to their fight in the promised land. At the end of the chapter, the Lord speaks to Moses and tells him to go up to the top of Mount Nebo, opposite the land of Moab and Jericho, to see the land of Canaan, the land that God is giving to the people of Israel. But Moses will not enter the land. Instead, he will die there on that mountain, and the people will gather to him, just as the people gathered to mourn Aaron. In chapter 33, Moses gives his final blessing to the people of Israel. Similar to how Jacob gathered together his sons to give a final blessing before his passing, Moses also gives a final blessing to each of the tribes. Finally, in chapter 34, Moses goes up to the top of Mount Nebo in the plains of Moab, and from the mountaintop the Lord shows Moses all of the land of Canaan, from the land of Gilead to Dan, from Naphtali to Ephraim, from the valley of Jericho to Zoar. This is the land which the Lord promised to Abraham. And Joshua, son of Nun, full of spirit and wisdom, who was commissioned by Moses, would be the one to lead the people of Israel into the promised land, and the Lord would provide a way for them against armies and nations far greater than they, so that the name of the Lord would be glorified, as all would know that it was the Lord who delivered Israel into the promised land. And with that, we have not only completed the book of Deuteronomy, but also the whole of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Although they are 5 separate books that each have their own unique themes and arguments that they're trying to make, all 5 of these books together have one central goal, which is to explain the origin of the people of Israel, and to give instruction about their covenant with God. I want to thank you all so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like, and if you'd like to see more of this series, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you again, and I hope to see you in the next one.